WBT.
Huh?
It's 5:04 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, we sit here this morning 1 week away until America decides Election Day 2024, and early voting continues to run away here in North Carolina through Sunday. That's the latest details that we've got this morning. Some 2.8 million voters have already cast their ballots across the Tar Heel state. That's 36% of voters statewide have already cast their ballot in the state, either by mailing them in or, of course, the ever-popular and long wait line early in-person voting. That puts turnout well ahead of where we were at this point in the 2020 general election. Of course, the last time there was a president on the ballot. In years past, early voting has tended to be dominated by Democrats, while Election Day voting has leaned Republican. But so far in 2024, it's Republicans with the advantage. 41% of registered Republicans have already voted, compared to 38% of Democrats, with 30% of unaffiliated voters. Now, that's the percentage of individuals that have voted. In terms of the partisan breakdown, there have been 961,000 Republican votes thus far, 938,000 Democrat votes, and 904,000 unaffiliated votes. So all of those votes within about 55,000 or so. Republicans, however, still with the edge. Again, as we sit here about a week from Election Day, we'll continue to track that throughout the week and get a full deep dive into the analysis on early voting with Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation coming up a little bit later on this week. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper announced $105.6 million in federal grants that were awarded to the North Carolina Railroad Company. That coming from the U.S. Department of Transportation to improve the state's rail infrastructure. This is through the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Program, a mouthful there. This funding will enhance a passenger and freight service along a 317-mile rail track from Charlotte all the way to Morehead City, bringing total project funding north of $170 million, with contributions from the North Carolina Railroad Company as well as the North Carolina Department of Transportation and rail operator Norfolk Southern. The upgrades, spanning 7 locations, including Raleigh, Cary, and Greensboro, will boost rail capacity, reduce delays, and support economic growth, safety, and environmental improvements. The North Carolina Railroad president, Pam Warner, emphasized the project's role in modernizing North Carolina's rail system thanks to bipartisan support and collaboration with Norfolk Southern. Construction is set to begin on this in 2025, and the project, again, reflects the commitment to reliable and accessible rail networks in North Carolina. This is major news, especially for the port out at Morehead City. We'll get some additional details on that with Jeff Moore from the Carolina Journal coming up a little bit later on this morning. Yesterday, it was a 3-judge panel from the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals that heard oral arguments in a GOP and /NC GOP lawsuit that is contesting some 225,000 voter registrations in North Carolina. Those oral arguments took place yesterday in the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And again, this lawsuit just a week ahead of Election Day. That panel's decision is expected soon. We'll have additional details coming up a little bit later for you this morning right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:08, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. There's been a lot of discussion about hurricane relief 4 weeks after Hurricane Helene left absolute and complete and total devastation out in western North Carolina. Syndicated columnist John Hood joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. John, good morning to you. Thanks for the time. You've got a new column up this morning. There's some big differences between what the General Assembly did last week and what the governor was asking for. Can you walk us through your column and how you see relief playing out thus far?
Well, certainly, when the legislature met last week, that was their second special session talking about Hurricane Helene relief. They had already done, a little about $300 million or so, let's say, of some initial money. The governor had said, let's do $3.9 billion. He had put it out a couple of days earlier. In fact, most of the legislature really had no idea how big this request was going to be. He had a lot of things in there that I think most of us would agree are probably going to have to be expended by state government. State and local government and federal government and private entities are all going to have a role to play in financing essential recovery in Western North Carolina. And maybe a lot of that $3.9 billion in ideas that Governor Cooper put on the table are worth doing. But the legislature decided, I think properly, not to do them last week. That was just too quick. They did about $600 million. I'm sorry, I said earlier $300 million. So it's about $800 million or so in total funding so far, or maybe $900 million. They're going to do more than that. It's going to get into the billions when you total up the federal, state, local spending, the private spending, probably even the tens of billions. But to do it so quickly, I think was an unreasonable ask from Governor Cooper. I put it in the column that Governor Cooper is almost certainly right that we're going to have to spend billions of dollars. But he was wrong that we needed to appropriate it immediately. And one of the reasons why I think that is because I've been around a few times and I've seen other hurricanes and legislative responses to hurricanes being too much or put in the wrong places. A good example would be back in 1999 with Hurricane Floyd, which hit eastern North Carolina.
Sure.
It was a different governor, a different legislature. The governor came up with this huge ask. And the legislature, in a quick special session after the hurricane, basically said, okay, here's all the money. Well, hundreds of millions of dollars of that money that had been set aside for that hurricane was never used for the hurricane relief because they ended up getting some numbers wrong. Some things were paid for by the feds that they didn't expect. Some things they just got the estimates wrong. So my argument about Hurricane Helene is, of course, state government has a lot of responsibility, particularly for state assets, things like roads, bridges, state university buildings, and things like that, and even for local assets. The state government needs to be helpful. But we need to make sure we get this right. There are lots of unanswered questions about who's going to pay for what really can be rebuilt as opposed to just relocated somewhere else. There's all sorts of questions about how much federal money will come down and in what form. And my argument, I think the legislature correctly concluded that they will come back again in another couple of weeks and they'll appropriate some more money and they'll get into 2025 and they'll keep working on this thing and they'll get it right rather than just giving an outgoing governor who's after all going to be leaving office at the end of this calendar year, giving him a $3.9 billion appropriation was an unreasonable ask and the legislature didn't say yes.
I'm glad you brought up some of the federal money here. We've heard from the leader of the House and the Senate that they've used the analogy. We don't want to get too far in front of our skis with the money because the feds will pick up the tab on some of this stuff. But John, as I understand it, they won't pick it up if the state already allocates too much money and pays for it. So maybe this is a little bit of a chicken and egg game race kind of going on here to make sure that we can get as much from the feds as possible before having to dip into the rainy day fund here in North Carolina.
That certainly could be. You know, I wish the federal government wasn't so heavily involved in disaster relief. Any particular storm is unpredictable, but the need to have a disaster relief program in a place like North Carolina that gets hit repeatedly by major storms is something that I think states and localities should plan on, years, even decades in advance. That's not the system we have, though. The system we have is the federal government has ended up being the major financer. And we're not going to do it in Florida or Louisiana or Iowa or something and then suddenly not do it in North Carolina. So I understand people's thought about trying to maximize the federal fund first and thinking about how the state, local, and federal funds interact. That's all important, and it argues for spending whatever weeks are necessary. It's not going to take many months to figure this out, but it may take a few more weeks, and I just think it was a wise decision by the legislature not to act precipitously as previous legislatures have done with previous hurricanes.
Syndicated columnist John Hood joins us. We'll continue the conversation after this on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:13, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Let's get a look at your Tuesday morning commute with Pam Warner.
All right, thanks.
WBT.
Your emergency situation station.
It's 5:19. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on Newstalk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. We are also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Well, here's an interesting story for you this morning. In a recent Forbes report, Charlotte ranked amongst the hardest commutes nationwide. The study, which editors said came from in-house editorial and data experts using various sources that deal with driving and roadway conditions, analyzed 8 major data points and 3 levels of fact-checking. Through the analysis, Charlotte ranked number 2 in the nation for the toughest commute. Charlotte has some 577,000 workers, with 2.5% without access to a car. Commuters averaged about a 28.5-minute commute to work, according to the study, and the Queen City has a walkability score of 26.4, with access to transit at 27.4%. Forbes' study also mentions that Charlotte has some of the, quote, worst roads and traffic congestion in North Carolina, end quote. According to the state, 33% of major roads are in bad or mediocre condition. That data coming from the National Transportation Research nonprofit, or TRIP, that does a yearly analysis of pretty much every state across the country and ranks their road conditions. Charlotte coming in as the second hardest commute nationwide. With all of that going on, early voting does continue across North Carolina. 2.8 million voters have cast ballots. That's almost 36% of voters statewide. That the two main forms of voting going on right now, of course, mail and in-person early voting, which wraps up this weekend on Saturday. That's the final day. Turnout at this point well above where it was in 2020. And in this year's election, when Democrats have typically had the edge, the advantage in early voting, it is now Republicans that have that lead. So far, 41% of registered Republicans have already voted. That's a combination of early voting and mail-in ballots, compared to 38% of Democrats and 30% of unaffiliated voters. You might be asking, why are unaffiliated voters so much lower than both Republicans and Democrats? Well, it has to do with their political propensity. And those unaffiliated voters who do not align with a political party, well, many of them are disconnected from traditional politics and are not as engaged as your typical individuals that register with one party or another. That's not the case for all or every unaffiliated voter, but that does explain part of why our largest voting bloc, which is unaffiliated, has the lowest turnout at just 30% thus far, compared to 41% Republicans and 38% Democrats. We'll continue to track early voting details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:22. Continuing our conversation this morning on hurricane relief with syndicated columnist John Hood this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. John, there, as you mentioned, Governor Roy Cooper asking for almost $4 billion. However, there has been some criticism from the legislature on an office known as the North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery. They've had a bunch of money allocated for past storms, and unfortunately, people are still suffering close to a decade later in some of these cases. Is that maybe also why you saw some hesitation from the legislature to write almost a $4 billion check, for lack of a better term, to just fund all of this stuff outright this early on?
I don't think we have to speculate about that, Nick, because I think some of the legislators said that when they were reacting to Governor Cooper's $3.9 billion request by saying, well, part of our concern here is that this Office of Recovery and Resilience had $175 million unanticipated shortfall of funds. They did kick some money in as part of what they did last week, I think about $30 million. But part of their point is, if we're still having trouble spending money that was appropriated in 2018 for the victims of Hurricane Florence, I think it was, then why are you asking for all this money up front? Is it going to take many years? Surely it won't take many years. In other states that were affected by hurricanes in recent years, they seem to have been able to spend their money for housing, get some of these dislocated folks into permanent housing more quickly than North Carolina did. I don't want to suggest that everything that North Carolina does is worse than, South Carolina or Georgia or Florida or other places. But in this area, it looks like we've got some problems that haven't really been ironed out yet. It's worth also pointing out, as I mentioned in the previous segment, everybody knows we're in an election season. We're electing a new governor next week. It's coming up. And new legislators, there are local elections, there are congressional elections. And so a different set of people are going to be making decisions about money on the front end. We're also electing a new state treasurer, a new state auditor, a new state superintendent of public instruction. And all of these officials in the coming months and years are going to be held accountable for how money is spent to rebuild our schools, manage our funds, do our roads, all these sorts of things. So my view is another reason to have not acted so precipitously, in addition to the fact that history is against it. We did have this shortfall in the Office of Resiliency and Recovery, but also we've got new people that are going to be elected and taking office in January. I think they need to have some say in what programs are set up, how they're set up, and how they're funded, because these are the officials who are going to have to administer it and govern it later and evaluate it. So I think that the fact that we've already had problems delivering hurricane recovery funds in North Carolina expeditiously and effectively during the Cooper administration argues for trying to get this right. If there's some programs that we just can't seem to do well in North Carolina, the state office doesn't seem to be able to move people into permanent housing in an efficient way, well, maybe we need to think about a different way to expend those monies for Hurricane Helene. This is an argument for prudence, not for perpetual delay, but for making sure we make sound decisions. This is a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer money. We need to spend it well.
It's a lot of money, and we've also seen that this will take years in many cases, especially for some more of these rural communities. It will take years to get them back up and running to where
just
things
in the
were
water
beforehand.
And sewer quality category alone, Nick, I don't mean to cut you off, but there are a few small towns in Western North Carolina that have essentially lost their entire water and sewer system. That is not something you rebuild in 60 days or 90 days. That will take months, if not years, to get back to its level. There are also some roads that are there. It isn't just that the roads were buckled or a tree fell across them or something. The entire cliffside that the road was on isn't there. So some of these expenditures will absolutely take years. We know that. We know that if we appropriate or authorize the money in January or February as opposed to November, it is not going to significantly change the calendar on things that are going to take years to replace. So let's get it right. Let's make the right decision.
That was going to be my question to you. Is the General Assembly will be back for their long session, likely another lengthy budget session coming up beginning next year. There really is no need, and as you just kind of highlighted, there is no need to rush this stuff forward, because come middle of January, these lawmakers will be back essentially full-time for months, probably until sometime late next summer, dealing with the regular budget and probably all of this relief as well.
That's right. I mean, some of what the governor wanted to do, Governor Cooper, again, not going to be governor very much longer, what he wanted to do was grants to individuals and households to rebuild businesses. Some of that may make sense. Some of it may be better as a loan program than a grant program. But the main thing is, don't hurry that. Don't act as if we don't do that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, that we can never do that, or that that's even the right way to think about the problem. There are entire downtowns or parts of downtowns that got washed away. Not going to be able to rebuild in the same place right now with all the infrastructure itself missing. So let's just calm down. This is a very serious problem. There are people who do need immediate relief, and the legislature has been appropriating money for immediate relief. But when it comes to longer term building back North Carolina, Western North Carolina, it's more important to get it right than it is to get it quickly.
John, where can folks read more on your column that we're talking about today?
Well, my column runs in lots of newspapers in North Carolina, but it always runs first at carolinajournal.com. So that's the place you want to go to read my columns on North Carolina politics and public policy.
John Hood joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. 5:28, well, now 5:29 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at traffic with Pam Warner.
Cheers.
It's 5:35. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. You can take the Carolina Journal News Hour with you on the go in your favorite podcast app. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap that subscribe button, and take the program with you on demand on your own time. You can also listen online by visiting WBT.com and clicking on podcasts. We've got a couple of legal updates this morning on ongoing cases here in North Carolina. We'll start off yesterday in the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals where oral arguments took place on whether a lawsuit contesting 225,000 voter registrations in North Carolina, whether that should be decided in state or federal court. The original suit filed by state and Republican and national Republican groups, the suit challenges registrations made on a chance that the form that they filled out did not require a driver's license or social security number, allegedly violating the federal Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. The North Carolina State Board of Elections had initially moved the case from state to federal court, where a judge ruled that the case's federal claims lacked standing, but suggested that the state's constitutional claims be addressed in a state court. The Republican National Committee and North Carolina Republican Party contend that voters using the now unsupported form should be required to confirm eligibility or vote provisionally. Democrats and the election board argue that the federal court is better suited to address this potential issue, while the Democrat National Committee is urging a dismissal of the state's claims as well. The panel's chief judge in Judge Diaz, along with Judges Gregory and Berner, voiced concerns about the impact of forcing provisional ballots and raised questions on the lawsuit's bias and jurisdiction. The panel's decision is expected soon. If you're a little confused about what exactly is going on here, well, there's a lot of back and forth. State court, then up to federal court. The federal judge says take it back to the state. There's a lot of moving parts. You can read more details by visiting our website. The headline on this story is Federal Appeals Court weighs fate of GOP challenge of 225,000 North Carolina voter registrations. You can read that at carolinajournal.com. And in some other legal news this morning, Governor Roy Cooper and Attorney General Josh Stein are urging the North Carolina Court of Appeals to uphold a lower court's ruling blocking Senate Bill 749. That piece of legislation, passed in the General Assembly's long session, would change the composition of the State Board of Elections, reducing the governor's power in board appointments. Cooper argues the law violates the Separation of Powers Act by removing his authority over the state election board and shifting appointment control to the legislature, the General Assembly. In March, a bipartisan panel of judges ruled in Governor Roy Cooper's favor, halting the law, which would replace the current 5-member board with an evenly split 8-member board chosen by legislative leaders. The panel argued that the law infringes upon the governor's constitutional role to oversee the executive functions. This appeal is the latest in the ongoing power struggle between the governor's office and the Republican-led legislature over control of the elections board and many other boards here across the state of North Carolina. It's now 5:39 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. A massive railway grant was issued last week in North Carolina. Jeff Moore from the Carolina Journal joins us with details this morning. Rail service, Jeff, has been a hot topic depending on what part of the state you're in. This is a massive announcement coming out last week. What are the details this morning?
Yeah, so you've got a federal grant coming to North Carolina of $105.4 million, I believe, and you've got a match from the North Carolina Department of Transportation, Norfolk Southern Railroad, and also the North Carolina Railroad Company. So this is actually going to affect the 317-mile corridor, the rail corridor from Charlotte that weaves its way through the Triangle and all the way east to the coast in Morehead City, where there's the port. And so with this, they're looking to make all sorts of improvements along the line, also trying to pick up on some of the passenger service for Amtrak. But the real story here is probably the economic development impact you'll have from the expanded capabilities of the rail line operated under Norfolk Southern's contract. So they move most of the freight on this line, and every improvement that they make along the way usually enables them to more safely operate and operate at higher speeds, which means you're getting freight materials to where they need to be faster and more efficiently. And that's good for consumers in North Carolina, for producers in North Carolina, things that are shipping. Companies that are shipping products out via train, and everybody importing products in through the port in Morehead City and getting that around the state. So it's a pretty big deal. I believe it's the largest federal grant that they've received, and they're going to have some matching from the state, from Norfolk Southern, and from the North Carolina Railroad Company. So it should have a positive effect on the economy going forward.
When we talk about this, is this more towards the commercial side of rail, as you mentioned, with getting products to and from ports, or is this a commuter rail that we're talking about, or is it some hybrid of both?
Yeah, there'll be some hybrid of both. Around the metro areas, you do have like higher rates of the Amtrak passenger train usage. And so there are going to be some improvements there. And the Cooper administration, the governor's office, is pushing the expansion of those services and hoping to get that into a more attractive area. They've really pushed light rail and commuter rail around some of the big metro areas in North Carolina for years now. These are projects that we've been noticing for years in places like California for getting buried in costs and never coming fully to fruition. So for us, the story really appears to be more of the commercial impact of it. This rail corridor was established in the 1800s. Old Governor John Motley Moorhead actually looked to expand this and charter a new corridor all the way to the coast and establish a new port outside of the Port of Wilmington, which that ended up being in Morehead City. So Morehead City, the town actually came to be at the terminus of that railroad, and it was one of the key points that turned North Carolina infrastructurally from being the Rip Van Winkle state that they had kind of labeled it as, because it was really falling behind the infrastructure development compared to Virginia and South Carolina. So the North Carolina Railroad Company is wholly owned by the state. It's a private corporation, but the state owns all of the shares, receives dividends for this, and it has partnerships with Norfolk Southern to operate on the line, as well as the NCDOT and the DOT to make sure that you can get as much commerce as possible out of this. So it really should be a good impact, but more so on the commercial side than on the passenger commuter side.
I'm glad you brought up the Port of Wilmington. We spoke last month, of course. There was the port strike that fortunately just lasted a couple of days, and we talked about the differences between the Wilmington port and the Morehead City port. The port in Wilmington is so much larger, Jeff, than Morehead City. Do you think this maybe bolsters and makes the Morehead City port a little bit larger, or should this maybe have been focused more on the Wilmington area where there's a much larger volume of things in and out of that port?
Yeah, and so the port in Morehead City has some limitations that they really can't get around. They're on a peninsula, and so the expansion area available to the port at Morehead City is very limited. So this is probably going to increase and have the most impact on the speed of what those aggregate materials coming in and out of the port of Morehead City can be. The Port of Wilmington obviously has a much larger operation, and they have a lot of focus as well from the rail lines that are coming through the Charlotte. So if you looked at a map of all the rail lines across North Carolina, you could follow this corridor from Morehead City all the way to its terminus on the other end in Charlotte, but you could also follow the spurs and kind of a web that go down to Wilmington as well. So improvements on this corridor, as far as they get past west of Raleigh, are really going to help improve the freight movement out of the Port of Wilmington as well. So it's not just the Port of Morehead City that will be affected. This will have a good positive impact on the operations of the Port of Wilmington as well.
Governor Roy Cooper seems to be pretty excited about this. What did he have to say with this announcement last week?
Yeah, so they're very encouraged, and on their side of the political aisle, they are bigger fans of some of the commuter rail projects and trying to push some of those in the kind of the Triangle metro area and the Charlotte area, even down to Wilmington, maybe connecting Raleigh and Wilmington. We've heard some talk about that. So they were happy to have that, happy to tout the federal grant to do those things, and also happy to have just more reasons to be able to go out there and speak to all the different corners of North Carolina and how the economy is touching them. It's not all the economic development announcements usually made in Raleigh. They affect every corner of the state. So it was good for him to get out there and tout this, especially in the middle of an election season.
Jeff Moore joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:45 and News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning with Pam Warner.
All right, thanks, Nick. And
It's 5:50. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Tuesday morning to you. Well, tomorrow, WBT's Talktoberfest News and Brews events takes place. It's happening at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts in Charlotte from 7 to 9 p.m. Tickets are going fast. Visit WBT.com for more details and to purchase your tickets now. The entire WBT air staff will be on hand for that. I'll be making my way out to Charlotte tomorrow morning at WBT.com for tickets for the Talktoberfest News and Brews event tomorrow night at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts, 7 to 9 p.m. We've got a lot of statewide news that we are tracking this morning. As you're beginning your commute in Charlotte, a recent Forbes study ranks Charlotte amongst the hardest commutes nationwide. The study, which came from in-house editorial and data using a variety of national and state road sources, analyzed 8 major data points across every state and city. Throughout the analysis, Charlotte ranked number 2 in the country for the toughest commute. Charlotte has approximately 577,000 workers. Commuters average about 28 and a half minutes to work, according to the study. Charlotte's walkability score, which was part of their metrics, is 26.4, and access to transit is 27.4% as well. The bikeability score is 31.3, and the Forbes study also mentions that Charlotte has some of the, quote, worst roads and traffic congestion in North Carolina, end quote. According to the state, 33% of major roads are in bad or mediocre condition. That coming from a yearly report from the National Transportation Research Nonprofit, or a group known as TRIP. They do that each year for every state. So Charlotte, the second hardest commute nationwide. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper announced $105.6 million worth of federal grants being awarded to the North Carolina Railroad Company, that coming from the U.S. Department of Transportation to improve the state's rail infrastructure. The grant is known as the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Program, and this funding will enhance passenger rail as well as a huge emphasis on freight service along a 317-mile rail corridor from Charlotte to Morehead City, bringing the total project funding to $170 million, as the North Carolina Railroad Company and NCDOT are kicking in about $65 million for the project. Rail operator Norfolk Southern also in on that as well. The upgrades, which will span 7 locations, including Raleigh, Cary, and Greensboro, will boost rail capacity, reduce delays, and support economic growth, safety, and environmental improvements. The president of the North Carolina Railroad Company, and Carl Warren, emphasized the project's role in modernizing the North Carolina rail system. He thanks bipartisan support and collaboration with operator Norfolk Southern. Construction is set to begin sometime next year in 2025, and the project does not have an end date. It will be an ongoing process to make the rail network more reliable here in North Carolina. Early voting continues to bang away here in the state through Sunday. That's the last day that we have data for. We'll get Monday's totals a little bit later on this morning. Some 2.8 million voters, or 36% of statewide voters, have already cast their ballots in North Carolina. The vast majority of those ballots being cast through early in-person voting, and as of right now, that puts turnout well ahead of where it was in 2020. I'll note, due to COVID in 2020, mail-in ballots were an incredibly popular form, so it's hard to draw a direct correlation between 2020 and 2024 with those factors in place. However, what is not hard to draw an analogy from is in years past, early voting has tended to lean heavily Democratic in the state, while Election Day voting has been handily controlled by Republicans. But so far, throughout early voting in this cycle, 41% of registered Republicans have already voted. That's compared to 38% of Democrats and 30% of unaffiliated voters. Taking a look at the total vote tallies thus far, over 961,000 Republicans have cast ballots, 938,000 Democrats, and 904,000 unaffiliated voters. So while all of those margins pretty close, within about 2.5% from unaffiliated to Republicans, it is very abnormal and not common for Republicans to be leading this deep into the early voting process. A lot of this due to the RNC, NCGOP, and President Trump's effort on telling folks to bank their votes and get out and early vote. This is not just something that is unique in North Carolina. We are seeing data seemingly daily out of many swing states, including Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, showing that early voting totals for Republicans in those states are well outpacing what those numbers were just a couple of years ago in the 2020 presidential election. We'll continue to track the early vote and get continued analysis later on this week with Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation. He'll join us coming up right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Governor Roy Cooper and Attorney General Josh Stein are urging the North Carolina Court of Appeals to uphold a lower court's ruling blocking a law known as Senate Bill 749. That piece of legislation would change the composition of the State Board of Elections, reducing the governor's power in board appointments. The governor argues that the law violates the Separation of Powers Act by removing his authority over state election boards, shifting appointment control to the legislature. In March, a bipartisan panel of judges ruled in the governor's favor, halting the law temporarily, which would replace a current 5-member board, which is appointed by the governor. And with that, obviously, there has to be a vote on one side or the other to make it pass, to an evenly split 8-member board that would be chosen by the General Assembly and legislative leaders. The panel argued that the law infringes upon the governor's constitutional role to oversee executive functions. This appeal is the latest in the ongoing power struggle between the governor's office and the Republican-led General Assembly over control of the election board. And not only would this have major control and major changes, rather, to the overall North Carolina State Board of Elections, this piece of legislation would also, Senate Bill 749, would also make changes to all 100 county Board of Elections, which are the ones that actually operate the elections. That's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning at 5 with the latest statewide news.